Hold! The morning light came through the thin curtains in a soft yellow way that always made the room look calmer than it was. Sarah lay there, warm under the quilt, watching dust drift along the square of brightness on the wall. She stretched slow, already feeling the promise of an ordinary day stack itself into place. Coffee, shower, the drive along County Road, the low brick office building with its choked shrubs and flickering exit sign. In that quiet seam between sleep and getting up, a cold glide moved under her belly, like a cautious hand drawing a line. At first she thought it was one of those slow cramps that come and go without cause, the body pulling an old trick just to see if you are awake. The glide deepened and slipped toward her side, deliberate like a small thing catching its balance. She pressed her palm to the place. The shape under her hand did not feel like muscle or gas. It pressed back, shy and slick, and drew away in a quick, ribboned motion that left the skin cold. She sat up. The quilt puddled in her lap, and the room smelled like dust and last night's shampoo. She waited for it to pass. It did not pass. It changed direction and went up, a winding motion that knew where it wanted to be. Fear came in small, crop-dusting swipes, and then a thicker wave. She stood, the old boards talkative under her feet, and moved toward the bathroom. Her breath did the odd light panting it sometimes did when she was late for something. The mirror over the sink took her in without kindness, hair half bent, face swollen from sleep, eyes that had not seen enough sun in a while. A tight scurry shot up her middle. The breath in her throat snagged. She gripped the edge of the sink. Her neck prickled where the hairline met skin. The left side of her throat swelled under her collarbone, and something inside pressed against that skin, a small point trying out the border. It was not pain. It was a steady, rummaging insistence. She lifted her hand, not sure whether to push it back or hold it still. The point eased away again, a shy retreat. She did not move for a long minute. The fan in the ceiling ticked with dust and the old bulb buzzed a little, all of it familiar and oddly loud. She touched the place on her throat again, both to make sure it was still just skin and to make sure she had not made it up. Nothing there but the soft thrum of her own pulse. She laughed in a way that was more air than sound. Fear did not like laughter and drained back a step. She reached for the faucet and ran the water. The pipes coughed like always. She cupped a drink to her mouth, and the water tasted like a garden hose forgotten in the sun. She remembered the Boyle advisory flyer from the town office and let the water run over her fingers instead. She stood like that, watching it, the small threads of light inside it, and waited to see if the movement would come again. When it did not, she moved through the morning, bread in the toaster, the refrigerator's constant whisper. She opened the door, and cold drifted out with the smell of something too sweet. She pushed aside a jar and took out the butter. There was a divot in the front of her favorite mug, a chip from years back when she had dropped it in the sink. When she poured the coffee, the chip caught light like a flaw in a window. She watched the light and told herself she was a nervous person with a jumpy stomach. She reminded herself that things inside the body have a lot of ignorance about who they belong to and what they should be doing. She buttered the toast and left the butter too long on the counter and did not put it back. The drive took her past the feed mill with its tin roof and two battered silos, and the grain trucks idling like dull animals. The smell there changed with the day. Some mornings it was warm and bready and good. Some mornings it was sour in a way that stuck to your clothes. Today, the air had that green smell of wet dust, like rain that had been planned and cancelled. She slowed at the four-way, where the red light liked to blink, even when it should not. The cross street was empty except for a late jogger, whose gait suggested more stubbornness than health. The office where she worked sat at the edge of an industrial lot with a view of the railroad spur. The building was one-story and flat and unambitious. The parking lot paint had faded to the faintest memory of lines, so everyone developed their own interpretations of straight. She parked between a dented pickup and a car whose bumper held together with the faith of duct tape. As she turned off the engine, the air went heavy and quiet in that way that made her re-listen for anything strange. The quiet carried only the high tick of the cooling engine, and from somewhere, the damp hiss of a distant compressor. Inside, the lobby had a plant that did not belong in this county, its leaves dusty and too shiny. A small bell sat on the desk, but nobody rang it anymore because everybody knew to walk back to the main office. The corridor smelled like scorched dust and paper and last winter. Fluorescence down the hall hummed with that thin insect pitch that hid in your jaw. She took her place in the narrow room with the printer and the racks of forms and the window that looked straight onto the loading dock. She settled into the chair that knew the shape of her shoulders too well. Paper had its own weather here. Some days it felt like a light snowfall. Some days it was a slow mudslide. Today it was something between. She fed forms and checked numbers against orders and stamped the receiving section and wrote signatures just the way the office manager liked, polite and undecorated. Out on the dock, men in reflective vests moved as if choreographed by a tired god. Forklifts beeped with mournful courtesy. Someone dragged a pallet, and the scrape of it sounded like a complaint. Before noon, she felt it again, a soft urge in the low part of her belly, then a tidy slip toward her spine, and then a pause that lasted just long enough to be a question. She breathed shallow and tried to count her breath, but counting made time get thick and slow. She decided to get up and get a cup of water from the cooler, then remembered the advisory notice under the magnet on her fridge at home, and took coffee instead. The coffee smelled like scorched earth. She set it on her desk and did not drink it. She told herself that maybe she had eaten too fast, or not enough, or the wrong thing last night, or something old had been tucked behind a jar in her fridge, something she had not meant to eat, but had eaten because waste felt like a sin. When she stood again, it rose higher, not alarmingly, just a slow, curious reach up her midline. She had a sudden thought of a blind insect trapped under a bowl, testing the rim. In the glass of the window, she saw her own reflection and stopped to look like it belonged to someone else. Her face did not look like the face of a sick person. It looked a little pale, yes, but she had been pale since winter set in and had never decided to leave. She lifted the scarf at her neck, more a habit than anything else, and pressed against the little hollow above her collarbone. Nothing. To be sure, she kept her palm there while she watched the loading dock. Her hand felt her own warm skin and the modest thud of her pulse and nothing else. A forklift beeped in the lot and a gull cried from nowhere. Her stomach made a small, wet sound. She did not think much of that sound. She thought instead of the steady, appraising movement inside her and felt her skin respond the way skin does to an approaching spider. She went back to her desk and made herself work fast. She filled out a stack of tags and flipped through with a brisk intention, like the act alone could jack up her body, pace, and leave whatever thing was inside behind. The printer stuttered and caught, and then tore the top edge of a page into a fringe. She held the page to line up the numbers and could not make the numbers settle. The letters looked damp for a second, as if the ink had sweated. The office manager walked past, humming a song that was not much of a song. She leaned in, a woman of neat hair and careful eyebrows. "You good?" she said, light, the way people try to ask without asking. "Fine," Sarah said. "Just need air." The manager nodded like she had expected that answer. "We're short on bottle today," she said. "Maintenance said the filters are off profile. Use the back tap if you need to." "We're okay," they said. "Not a full boil thing." "I saw the flyer," Sarah said, because saying anything made her look fine. The manager moved on, heels making small, sensible decisions along the linoleum. At lunch, Sarah did not eat. She took her sandwich from the bag and set it on her desk and watched the bread dry. She tried a bite and it turned to paste, and she chewed while her throat considered whether it was interested in swallowing anymore. In the end, it changed its mind, and she took the rest of the bread to the break room and put it in the bin under the sink, where the smell of old coffee and bleach had settled into something like a chemistry set. In the afternoon, the wind picked up and pulled a few trailers of grit across the lot. Men stepped in, shook themselves like dogs, and tracked the fine dust in. The dust had a faint, sour smell, like harvested grain had been kept too long in some damp ballast. It hit the back of her throat and made her eyes water. She looked at her desk and realized the small line of paper clips she kept in a careful row had shifted positions from how she always set them. They were pointed the wrong way. The wrong way felt absurdly personal. When the day ended, she drove home with the radio on and low. The radio found only static and a weather report finished in a hurry. A siren somewhere tried to make itself known but could not decide which way to go. She watched the fields that had shed their color and thought of what it would be like to be a small animal under snow, alive and disciplined and absolutely where it belonged. The thought calmed her enough to make it to her driveway without rehearsing an emergency plan. Her duplex had the narrow stoop the owner had swore he would fix after the first thaw. She fit the key in the lock, and the lock gave with a complaint like any other day. Inside, the smell of a place kept by one person came right to her. Detergent that never quite left the air, the sweetish remainder of last night's tea, the foundation note of old wood. The refrigerator hummed in its steady way, and the radiator gave a small tap once in a while, like it was someone else living above her. She went to the bathroom and stood under the fluorescent's hard blessing and unwrapped her scarf. The skin of her neck looked like it always had, pale with a few careless freckles. Her collarbones made the shallow grooves they always had. She pressed there with her fingers and waited. She said, quiet and flat, "Don't." The thing inside moved like a polite apology and slipped lower. She laughed again, that breathy, almost sound. She put the scarf back on. She made tea and let it steep too long and drank it anyway. She turned on the television and clicked through a handful of channels, then turned it off because the sound felt like a trumped-up version of a normal day. The room went still in a usable way. She stood at her window and watched the alley, which gave her nothing except a stray cat sniffing a bag of leaves. Upstairs, someone walked steady back and forth above her kitchen, and she remembered there was no one living upstairs anymore. She stood there longer than made sense. The cat wandered off. The refrigerator's hum deepened and then lowered again like a note held and released. She laid her hand flat over her stomach and moved it slow upward, and when she reached the place just under her breastbone, the same small glide ticked along her palm like a fish tasting the surface. She slept little. The old quilt felt heavy in the way of things that have listened to too many winter nights. Hours wore by and did not leave footprints. From time to time the movement came again, small and diplomatic. It did not seek to upset, not exactly. It seemed to be trying out the house of her. If she held still, she could imagine it was some waking dream that aligned with the radiator tapping and the muffled click of someone else, door 2 houses down. When she drifted, she dreamed of smooth stones turning under a stream, slow as thought. In the morning, she woke with her mouth dry and a thin metallic line at the back of her tongue. Her chest had a tightness like a ready cry, pressed down and taught to sit. She dressed with more care than usual, not from vanity, but as if neatness alone could keep the edges of her life from ruffling. She chose a high-collared sweater and then told herself she was not hiding anything from anyone. On the drive, she noticed 3 crows sitting equally spaced on top of the rail of the little bridge near the mill. They watched the water as if they had paid for a show. The feedlot had a new sign taped to the door, its tape lines crooked and impatient. She passed it and did not try to read. The sky held a low, smooth gray, like a pressed sheet of metal. That day, the printers went out of alignment. Labels cut too low. Forms shifted half an inch to the left. Every page had a stubborn ghost image of whatever came before. She wrestled settings and got nothing. The office manager called maintenance and got a boy with hair in his eyes who looked at the machine like it had betrayed him personally, and then shook his head and said it would have to wait. People did not love that answer, but people carried it like they carried other things. The water cooler was ringed with small paper cups, each with a lip mark. She walked past, and not one cup looked like it belonged to a person who would never be sick. The movement inside came rarely that day, but when it came, it was audacious. It wrapped her middle in a slow belt of pressure and then loosened. Late in the afternoon, it came up her throat with a quickness that made her gag. She swallowed air and brought up nothing but the feeling of something pointed testing the wall behind her tongue, left her standing over the trash can for a dangerous minute while the break room clock failed to tick with any urgency. Everyone had a version of care to offer. A trucker in the dock office said it was nerves. The office manager gave her a peppermint hard candy like a kindergarten prize. The boy from maintenance, the one with hair in his eyes, said he had had something like that once, and it turned out to be nothing but a muscle twitch. He lifted a hand and fluttered his fingers in the air to show what a harmless little dance the body could do. He smiled, then stopped smiling when the smile did not work. He looked away like a person backing out of a driveway. She told them thank you because not saying it would make her strange. That second night the house crowded in close. The radiator made a knocking that was not the old familiar knock. It had a new second note in it, a small after sound like a repetition in a bad recording. The hallway air smelled like cold laundry. The kitchen clock on the stove had stopped sometime that day and would not be convinced to pick up again, so she covered it with a dish towel. When she lay down, the ceiling had a faint stain she had never seen, a ragged oval like the outline of a leaf. The refrigerator hummed louder and then softer, and then decided on a middle course that did nothing to calm the room. The thing inside her finished whatever tour of her lower half it had scheduled and climbed. She got up and went to the bathroom and locked the door, though there was no one to keep out. The mirror showed her what she already felt, a body that was not interested in the stories she told about being fine. She bent over the sink. Her throat worked with an animal bluntness, trying to understand a task new to it. The feeling came not quite painful, a driven pressure up the left side. At the angle of her jaw, something hard, the size of a small knuckle, traveled under her skin, pausing for a steady, cruel second, then sliding forward. She put her hand there and felt the ridge of it move beneath her hand, stubborn as a bead under a rug. The sensation was cold inside, not the right temperature for flesh. Her eyes watered. There was a thin scraping in her right ear, like a pencil touched lightly to paper. "Don't," she said again, a whisper that felt foolish. It did not listen, or maybe did not hear. It reached the hollow just below the hinge of her jaw. The pressure sharpened then, in a way that carried the intention to break through. Her skin dimpled. The surface whitened to a pale oval, like a thumb pressed against dough. She felt the very tip of something hard, almost sharp, find a seam in the muscle there and push. She was held there in that balanced second, both present and not present, as if any move would make her become the person in the story who tried or failed. It stopped, just that. It withdrew in a slow, single standing wave, the way a creature might draw back after tapping a glass wall. The skin smoothed. The ache that followed felt weirdly tender, a bruise without color. She leaned her forehead against the mirror and left a fogged oval that read like a sign. When she lifted her head, she found she had been crying, but the tears were unwilling to drop, held to her lashes by simple, stubborn tension. She wiped them with the heel of her hand. She turned on the faucet and listened to the water. She did not drink. She held her hands under and felt her palms go past cold to that numb, sweet not feeling where the nerves take a break. She turned the tap off, and the house widened again like a small mercy. The next days narrowed and repeated. The office hummed with the sound of tasks that tried to fill the shape of a working day. Forms came in crooked, figures did not sit right in their boxes. A carton broke at the seam it had been told to hold. People devoted long minutes to the just shy misalignments that seemed to fall from everywhere. The boy with the hair said supply had changed apart without notice, but nobody believed him, not really. They believed something was wrong with the whole store of parts, or with the water in the pipes, or with the air. They believed in tiny faults coming back from somewhere they could not point to, but had known all along. A notice went up by the clock about a closure at the clinic, a staffing interruption, a system out of service. It had the tone of a politely worded excuse and promised a return to normal that felt like a lie even to the person who typed it. People made a show of not reading it. The office manager folded her careful arms and said it would all smooth out if people kept on. Her eyebrows stayed neat even while she said it. At lunch, Sarah chewed carrot sticks with the mechanical patience of a cow. The taste of everything had turned faint and runty. She could not quite find salt, could not quite find sweet. Water tasted like there were small, clean stones in it. One afternoon, she lifted her cup and smelled something copper that made the roots of her teeth ache. She set the cup down and then, after a minute of pretending she had not, drank anyway. The thing inside shifted its attention as if it too had opinions. At home, she began to fold towels more carefully. She kept one near the bed and one by the bathroom door and one by the sink. She could not have said why the sight of them, tidy and stacked, helped. Maybe it was the confidence of their shape. Maybe it was that they carried the ghost warmth of the dryer and spoke of something domesticated and safe. She kept a mug by the sink and rinsed it twice every time, though she did not drink from it. She sorted the receipts she saved for no real reason into a stack. The paper edges had a tacky drag that the fingertips do not like. The dates on them felt like lies, though she knew her brain was making that up. She slept shallow. When she did dream, it was of small rooms, and the same door always on the same wall, and a slow wind that appeared to come from a floor vent, but which she knew not to trust. More than once, she woke with her hand clamped to her throat in a way that left nail marks. The movement inside had grown more assured. It understood her map, and it took the routes it preferred. The pressure against her throat came regular as stores opening for the day. It pressed, tested, withdrew, wandered. In the quietest parts of night, a faint tickle sounded in her ear, the whisper of something passing through a narrow place. Sometimes her vision pulsed at the edges, like the world itself blinked. The refrigerator's hum sometimes settled into a low chord that matched the rhythm behind her ribs, the two notes finding each other by accident and holding for a long breath before drifting apart. She started clearing out the bathroom cabinet in small fits. She threw out expired pills and an old perfume that had gone sour and a nail polish the color of a spring leaf she had bought for hope. She found a little plastic box with cotton squares she had forgotten, soft and neat, each square with tiny dots like a code. She kept those, not sure why, and put them in the top drawer where she could reach without thinking. On the third or maybe fourth morning of this, she met her neighbor at the mailboxes. The woman was the kind who wore slacks that never wrinkled and had a way of moving as if she had been told where to step by an unseen hand. She held a stack of envelopes with thumb and side palm like a dealer holds cards. "You look pale," the woman said, not unkindly. "Woke early," Sarah said. The woman nodded like that explained anything. "They're saying there's something in the air from over by the trestle," she said. "Some sweep they did with the sprayers. It went sideways. It's what my sister says. Her brother-in-law works county. That was the shape of a lot of news around here. County had said this. The plant had done that. Water was safe, but safer later." The woman peered at her a second longer. "Drink bottled," she said. "The tap's gone metallic." "I will," Sarah said. She would not. "One more thing," the woman said, lowering her voice like she had that right. They're closing the clinic today, half day. System out. People will have to go to Lincoln or wait. Thanks, Sarah said, because saying thanks made the woman feel her role in the community and made the moment end. The woman went on, her slacks holding their shape without effort. The alley smelled like someone had washed something with a cedar detergent, and then a sour note had taken over. Sarah looked into her mailbox and found 3 thin envelopes and a flyer. The flyer had a big lettered warning of some kind about flushing lines and patience. She touched the edge of it and felt that stickiness again, as if the paper came with a film on it. She tried to work that day. The numbers floated into and out of position like small fish. When she began a task, she would later find she had finished the wrong version of it. The office manager's eyebrows tried to keep order. Outside, a truck took too long backing up to the dock, and the beeper's sympathetic cry drove itself into her jaw. She stopped noticing hunger. She watched a man on the dock lift his hand to the side of his neck and scratch the same spot over and over, the skin slowly reddening in a tidy oval. He did it without thought, the way a person adjusts glasses. Late afternoon, when the fluorescent wine felt like it had learned a new frequency just to find her bones, the pressure rose from her stomach with a methodical confidence that did not ask permission. It moved like a taught skill, not a spasm. It paused at her sternum because a pause there seemed required, then traveled up the narrow space behind her throat. This time, there was an audible click, like a knuckle cracking from inside the long muscle that ran up under her ear. No one else in the office reacted. No one else's ear had cracked. The point pushed out toward the skin. She pressed it back with her fingers, careful as a person pushing a creature back into a terrarium. She left early. She did not tell anyone she was leaving early. She stood up and put her scarf on and took her bag and let the door of the office close behind her with its ordinary latch. No one called after her. The hallway had a warmer smell than usual, like the building had been left to itself on a summer day and had decided to bake. When she stepped into the cold light by the loading dock, the color felt too white for the edges of the building, and the piles of pallets looked like a tired puzzle. In the car, she sat with her hands on the wheel until the steering column warmed her palms. She drove without the radio because every sound it made had begun to feel like a wrong answer. She rolled the window down a crack at the light and breathed the air in a careful, measured way. Her throat felt occupied, like a room someone else had rested a coat in. The crows were still on the bridge, 2 now, as if one had found better work. At home, she filled the tub and sat in the water with her knees up. The water smelled faintly of pennies. She watched her skin under the water, pale and distorted by the moving surface. When the movement came again and slipped up along the ribs on her left side, she could see it, a ribboned drag, a ripple, as if something pressed up from beneath and skimmed along. It moved like a bend, traveling under a rug. She lay back and held her breath to see if it changed with the stillness. It did not. It was its own measure. It found the throat again. She sat up fast. The water made small waves against the porcelain, and the sound was delicate in a way she did not trust. She set her hand at her neck, and the thing came forward under her palm, repeating a path it liked. It pressed the same small point against the same seam in her jaw. The point found the edge of something and worried it. She pictured a tiny white, like a small antler point, not bone, not bone. She held her breath again in a childish bid at control. The point pressed. The skin grew thin under it, the way bright light makes the skin of your finger look like a red glass. She did not know why she did it, but she began to hum, soft and without melody, the way a person hums to a baby that needs calming. The sound was low, a throat song that matched the refrigerator hum from the other room, as if 2 notes had finally agreed to meet. The point hesitated. She changed the shape of the hum, lower and even. The thing inside drew back a little, as if the sound made it uncertain. She kept humming until her throat vibrated in a way that felt like a plea inside a pipe. It withdrew, almost sulking. Her own breath came back ragged and a little sore. She let the water go. It went down slow and made a funnel whose sound had always bothered her. She watched the last of it circle and vanish with a thin cluck. The air that replaced the water felt colder than it should. She wrapped a towel around her neck and left it there, as if that would persuade some boundary to hold. She put on a sweater with a collar that sat high and soft. She turned off the light, and the house received the dark without thinking too much of it. She did not cook. Hunger had become like the radio, a thing that said too much for what it was. She left the television off because the colors it gave off had grown brittle and showed her the seams in everything. The night was long and not unfriendly. She sat in the kitchen with the refrigerator talking in its quiet way, and the radiator tapping and the water line somewhere in the wall having a small private hiccup once in a while. The towel held the warmth of her skin and carried it back to her slowly, like a loan repaid. Close to the hour before dawn, when the world unbuttons a little and lets thoughts in that would not dare come earlier, she heard a noise from the hallway outside her door. It was the soft sound of paper sliding along tile. She listened and heard it again. She went to the door and pressed her eye to the peephole and saw no one. When she opened the door, the hallway lay quiet as usual. A slip of paper had been shoved under the door from the building office. She lifted it, the paper cool, the ink shiny as if licked by damp. It was a notice about maintenance on the main lines and how people might hear banging and might see clouded water and should not be alarmed. Alarm struck her as a big word for such small instructions. A final line, added by hand in a neat, careful block, said that residents should not run their dishwashers tonight and should not drink from bathroom taps. The word "not" was underlined twice. She stood a long moment with the paper in her hand and thought about kindness and what counted. She slept a little in a chair. When morning came, the light on the wall did its soft yellow thing and she let it stay. She showered with the towel nearby. When the movement came, she hummed again and felt the thing pause. She brushed her teeth and spat into the sink and saw a faint reddish smear that did not smell like blood. She looked to see if a gum had receded, if a tooth had cut something. Everything looked normal and pink and dull. At work, the labels were off again, the cutter shaving the wrong places, and the optimists said it would all resettle after the lines had been flushed. A man on the dock used a handkerchief to wipe at his ear with a mortified look, as if his ear had become a rude stranger he had to deal with. The boy from maintenance said they were seeing mill moths up in the rafters, where moths had no reason to be in this season, and he demonstrated a flutter with his fingers like a card trick. His hair hung in his eyes and gave him cover. By late day, the pressure inside Sarah had grown bold again. Instead of a single assertive scout, it felt like a small braid of motions, multiple slips testing at once. It seemed to listen to her. When the office hummed with a certain pitch, it woke. When silence fell, it drifted. In the very sudden quiet when a pallet was set down and all the other sounds were caught holding their breath, it reached out under her skin to try a new seam. She left a new note for herself on the pad next to the printer, a silly command in small, tidy letters, hold. When she came back past the printer later, the note had slid to a different angle, a lazy turn, as if the machine's little vibrations had nudged it. She set it back square, and that made her feel like someone who had done something. That night she opened the refrigerator and stood there too long. The light inside made her eyes ache. The butter had softened into a possible shape. The jar of something sweet had begun to sweat in a way tightened lids should forbid. She shut the door, and the hum changed to a deeper gear that actually felt good along her bones. She stood with her back against the door, and the hum and the buzz of the ceiling light made a low chord that met the one she knew in her chest. She kept her back to it until they all matched. She sat in the dark with the only light a small line from the street under the blind. She wrapped a towel around her neck as if for a sore throat, though it was not sore. In the quiet, she could hear something faint in the walls. Not a mouse, not a pipe. A hair-thin scrape, like someone drawing a needle across a plate that had already been cracked. In that soft dark, she understood a new thing. The movement in her did not want to leave. It wanted instead to meet the room. It wanted to meet the humming refrigerator and the radiator's mild reluctance, and the small paper note and the towel folded on the chair. It wanted to hold the room at the same time that it held her. This startled her more than the pressure. She had supposed it would seek an exit like any intruder, but it did not behave like a thief. It behaved like a new renter, testing doors. She tried sleep in the bed again because chairs make your neck ache, and she had enough of that. The movement came and went, never harsh, always sure. Once toward dawn, when the grey of the window knew it would be day, whether it deserved to be or not, she felt the pressure at the base of her tongue and saw in the mirror the very faintest paleness under the skin there. She touched it with a fingertip, and it slipped away, coy as a fish. At work the next day, the office manager gave out masks from a box that had been in a closet since the years when boxes like that got opened a lot. The masks had a faint smell of old glue. People wore them with a performance of duty. The office manager said there had been advisories about dust from the far field and about a maintenance run on the water mains that would rattle pipes. She said, in the voice of a person who kept lemonade in the freezer for bad days, that it was nothing. She believed it might be nothing if people agreed it was. Sarah wore the mask and felt the humid cup of her breath make a personal weather on her face. The movement inside responded to the closeness as if the change in air pointed out new rooms to it. It pressed up at the hollow of her throat, and this time the push was not a tap, but a slow, convincing pressure that brought tears to her eyes. She went to the restroom and locked the door and stood there under the rattle of the fan. She lowered the mask and pressed both palms to the sides of her neck and thought of the soft cotton squares in her drawer at home. She hummed again, almost soundless. The thing held still for the time it took her to roll her shoulders and find a breath that did not feel like a hazard. When she came out of the stall, a woman from shipping stood at the mirror dabbing powder under her eyes. The woman did not look at her, not really, just said, "Air's rotten today," as if the remark might dissolve whatever hovered between them. Sarah said, "Smells like the inside of a radiator," and that small shared joke broke something open that made it possible to walk back to the office without being watched. That afternoon, a call came from the clinic, an old recording repurposed for this, asking people to wait on non-urgent appointments and to call only if something had returned to worse. She listened to the recording not because it applied to her, but because the voice had the quality of someone who had decided to speak evenly and lightly in the face of an unmoved animal. The voice reminded her of her humming. It did nothing the way her humming did something. She went home before full dark and changed into a softer sweater with the collar up. She stood a long time at the bathroom mirror with the door shut and the fan off. When the movement came and pressed hard just under her jaw, she put 2 fingers there, light as a person might touch the back of a bird. Under the skin, a small ridge slid and found its place as if it had returned to a known path. She thought of bones growing like leaf veins, of a map being drawn without her. She reached into the top drawer and took one of the cotton squares and folded it and pressed it there, and then set a strip of tape from the cabinet across it, neat and tight. The tape made a sound like a very small tear when it left its roll. She stayed like that, regardful and still, until the pressure eased. Later, when she peeled the tape away in the light over the kitchen sink, the cotton square held a faint stain, shaped like a small comma of pearly wet, colorless, and almost luminous. It did not smell like anything she knew. She wrapped it in toilet paper and buried it at the bottom of the trash under the coffee grounds, as if it needed to be humbled. The nights came one after another, and each brought a slightly changed version of quiet. The radiator learned a new rhythm and then unlearned it. The upstairs stayed empty. The hallway light burned through one bulb and then another, and the building office left a third one dimmer than both. In her sleep, the thing inside her mapped more, and some mornings she woke to find an ache at the base of her skull, as if a new road had been laid. She hummed less and listened more. The room had its own song, and the one inside her learned it. She began to hear a second tone in the refrigerator's hum, a thin overtone that had not been there before, a thread of sound that leaned toward her. When she sat at the table and set her hand on the wood, the grain spoke in a way she could not translate. The towel against her neck warmed to her and then warmed her back, and they made a small circuit of heat that felt almost companionable. The fear did not exactly leave. It changed its logic. It learned to stand in the doorway rather than sit on her chest. Late in the week, a rain moved over town that was more a heavy mist, a pushy fog that held the smell of tin and road. She cracked the window because a person needed air, even when the air had grown strange. Somewhere outside, a compressor kicked on and off in a cycle that did not respect ordinary patterns. Between those pulses, in the tight quiet, she heard a scratch from somewhere between the walls. A faint series of dry sounds, like a small thing taking a polite walk across a sheet of paper. She stood and went to the kitchen. The refrigerator hummed in its plural way. The stove clock still wore its dish towel shroud. The sink dripped once in a while with the gravity of a metronome in a different room. She stood there, one hand flattening the towel at her neck, and listened to the thin wall scratch, and to the breath the room took around her, and to the new inward sound that had come to live between her ear and her jaw. The movement pressed once, not hard, as if to make a point. She reached up and found the familiar place and pressed back. 2 fingers, gentle and sure, the way you encourage a dog to stay behind a line on the floor. From the fridge, the hum stepped down 1 notch and found the note in her chest and stayed. It was soft and even and the same. The towel had the smell of laundry soap and her own skin. She stood there for a long while, not exactly holding her breath, not exactly breathing. The sense of an arrival not yet complete, folding itself slowly, carefully, into the room. The rain that came the next morning was more like breath on glass than weather. Sarah watched it from the window with the blind raised a few inches, the way she had been doing without realizing it, as if measuring the town by the thickness of that damp. The alley held the glide of wet tires. Somewhere farther off, a horn gave out 2 short notes that sounded uncertain about their purpose. She made coffee and set the mug on the table and did not drink it. The steam rose and tried a shape, then lost interest and went flat. The refrigerator's hum sat in the low register she had come to know. It had a second thread through it, thin as fishing line, that changed with the room. When she moved, it moved. When she went still, it steadied. She put on the high-collared sweater again and lifted the folded towel and warmed it between her hands before settling it around her neck like a small ceremonial. Work was not an argument she could make that day. She wrote a message on a slip and stuck it to the inside of her door for the building office to collect if they felt like it. Something about being out, about not feeling right, about trying tomorrow. She signed only her first name. She stood a long minute with her hand on the knob and listened to the hall. The silence there felt heavier than the rain. She went back to the kitchen and flipped the dish towel down from the stove clock, because a person should not pretend not to see a blank face for too long. It made superstition too easy. The dead display shone in its smooth nothing and told her exactly what she already knew. She covered it again, the pattern of the towel something like wheat stalks in green. The towel had a stitch pulled loose near one corner where it had caught on something once. That small loop of thread had grown longer lately, making a long, thin question mark when the light was right. She held her hands to her throat and waited. The movement there held off a while. It seemed to understand the rules of mornings in a place like this. The radiator clinked twice, not its old pattern, but not a new one either, a compromise between the two. Upstairs stayed empty. Her neighbor across the hall went by at one point, shoes making a neat little conversation, and a second later came the tidy click of the lock. She wondered whether the neighbor had narrowed her life the way Sarah had, without calling it that. She took the cotton squares from the drawer and set two on the edge of the sink, ready. The tape sat beside them. The end turned back on itself because in moments when she needed it, she did not want to be the kind of person who fought a role for the first edge. She moved the mug to the right spot on the table, the place where the chip turned toward her like a tooth. She stood there longer than a person should, as if waiting for a show to begin that would not begin until the audience behaved. The movement came without warning, up through the middle, sure and worldly. It found the seam along the left side of her throat and pressed. It did not jab, it eased. The pressure was intimate and impersonal at once. She set two fingers against it and hummed, straight to the pitch the refrigerator carry gave her, and the thing paused to listen, then moved under her hand like a hidden joint articulating. The skin grew thin in an oval the size of a small coin. It did not break. She held. It held. The room listened in the way of rooms. When it eased back, her breath left her in a soft sheet. She was not relieved so much as granted a reprieve. She cleaned herself with one of the squares, though there had been no leak this time, and put it back, dry, in the drawer, because touching its clean texture felt like an argument for order. She put on her shoes and a coat and the scarf and opened the door and stepped into the hall. She left the towel on. Outside, the rain carried a smell like wet bolts tumbling in a bucket. The street at the end of the alley had signs taped to poles about lane closures and waterwork and cooperation. People drove with a particular kind of caution that described no accident, but described the idea of an accident hanging nearby. The air had a taste that made the back of her tongue scold. She walked past the feedlot on the long way around because walking somewhere that smelled like animal breath and grain had always made her feel like someone's child. The lot fence had a new length of bright wire that did not match the rest. Crows sat on the wire as if it had been put there for them. One lifted and rearranged itself, its feathers making the sound of paper being shaken. The grocery store had a sign at the entrance reminding people about patience and reduced hours and the wherefore of stock. Inside the door, a line of hand baskets waited like a row of turtles. People moved through the aisles with a slowed grace. Nobody grazed. Nobody held a phone. In the water section, gaps opened like missing teeth. A stock boy with a soft beard and anxious shoulders had taped up a paper notice about a shipment tomorrow. The word tomorrow looked hopeful and uncorrect. Sarah picked up a case of seltzer, not because she wanted bubbles, but because the water had a different mouthfeel, and that felt like choosing. She took tea and rice and a new bar of soap and a package of cheap towels in a color that could not decide between brown and green. In line, a man ahead of her wore a neck brace. He stood very upright because there was nowhere else to put himself. The brace was the kind that velcroed at the back with a quiet rip. He lifted a hand to the space above his collar and scratched in a neat square, the way a person wipes a window with less fervor than the window demands. At the register, the scanner sliced the air with its bright beep, and each beep made a little pressure along the inside of her left ear canal. The cashier was a woman whose hair had been the same shade for as long as anyone could remember, a red that had never lived in the world. She said the total in a voice that used only the small muscles and took the seltzer like it weighed more than it weighed. "Air's been funny," the cashier said, staring past Sarah's shoulder at the automatic doors, which opened and closed like a lung in slow motion. "You smell it?" "I do," Sarah said, and took a bag. The automatic doors whispered as she passed, and outside the world felt slightly tilted, like an old house with corners that had learned to shrug. She walked home the long back way, past the rail spur where the crows were getting their day's entertainment from the idea of rust. Back in the apartment, She packed the towels into the closet and stacked the seltzer in a neat square against the kitchen wall. The refrigerator's hum greeted her, and her chest answered without being asked. She touched the door of the fridge and felt its low working through the metal, cool and confident. She thought of unfamiliar words she had heard once, to do with resonance and nodes and standing waves, and how bridges sometimes remembered bad marches. She did not know the words to say what she felt. She knew she had been counted. She opened a can of seltzer and took a sip, and the bubbles pranked her throat. The movement inside rose in a single clean line in response, as if the water had been an invitation to dance. She laughed without sound and steadied her fingers at the usual spot. The pressure was polite. It tested, pressed, almost a question. The skin warmed under her hand, where warmth had seldom collected. She thought of a bird on a wire stepping into balance, and then later stepping off. It drew back and settled low again, like a careful, hinged lid. The afternoon slid by in quiet labor. She washed the towels she already owned for no reason but to listen to the washer S-drum thump in the hall laundry like a distant, polite heart. At one point, the machine gave a small squeal, and the sound drew a thin, answering scrape in her ear, and she stood still with her hands on the warm lid until both sounds found each other and turned into a depth note that she could hold on to like a railing. She cut the loose thread from the dish towel so it would stop asking questions. She rewrote the small note by the stove about flushing the lines, copying it on a piece of ruled paper in her careful hand because her copy might make it more true. She rearranged the forks so that the tines all pointed the same way and set the mug so the chip bit met the light. She pressed each of her cotton squares back into neat stacks and turned the tape over to press the end more decisively to the roll. She turned off the television early for a day in which she had never turned it on, and this made the air cleaner, as if the set had been emitting an allegiance to old noise. When evening came, it did not so much arrive as come into focus. The street noise thinned and then went bright a few times, as if someone somewhere was running a bandsaw repaired by faith alone. The radiator had a new calm. It exhaled and was quiet, exhaled and was quiet, like a person who knows they are being watched and breathes evenly to prove it. She heated water and made tea, and the steam made a ghost in the kitchen light and then tore itself apart. She ate rice, plain, and found the texture almost sweet, though the taste nowhere. Her tongue felt blunt and sad, the way an overused tool feels in the hand. After the dish was clean and the sink wiped down in its usual circles, she stood with her palms on the cool enamel and waited without trying to say what she was waiting for. A small sound came from within the wall, right where the pipe made its modest bend. The sound was like the scratch of a match struck without intent to light. It came 3 times. She answered it by doing nothing. Close to full dark, there came a thump down the hall, as in a building where neighbors forget there are neighbors. She heard quiet voices at the far end, a tone like people trying not to wake a baby. The stairlight flicked and held. She sat on the edge of her bed and wrapped a towel around her neck and leaned forward, elbows on knees, a position that tried to negotiate with whatever angle her breath preferred. Her window held a smear of the street lamp that never got repaired. She began humming without thinking. The note she made matched the room with no effort. It was as if the room had kept it for her. Her throat vibrated in a way that was neither painful nor pleasant. The movement inside pushed politely against the high place, the place under the hinge of her jaw. Her fingers met it as they had been trained to do. The skin thinned and held. The pressure stayed. It stayed long enough to tell her that this would not be a practice run. A memory slipped in of the boy from maintenance making that flutter with his fingers. A card trick that was meant to show how harmless things could be. She saw his sloppy hair, the tired willingness in him. She let the image pass like a cloud. The point under her skin found its seam and worried. The surface went pale, then paler, then almost a little luminous. But maybe that was a trick of the bad bulb. She kept the hum low and steady, a consolation for a child not in the room. Her breath flattened, because there was not room for it to be tall. The first touch of sharpness came like the lightest pin held to the surface. It pressed and then stopped, and then pressed again. Careful as someone learning a lock, she said very quiet, "Wait," though that seemed like a word for something else. She took a square from the counter and pressed it just aside, not on top, because pressure on the top sounded like panic. She held the hum like a wire between her teeth. When it pierced, it did so as if the skin had always understood the plan. There was no dramatic breach. There was the smallest surrender. A pinprick, no more. A pearl of clear rose up into the cotton square as if it had been called by name. No smell. The point behind it pushed with all the dignity of a growth that had been promised a finish. She did not gasp. She did not cry out. She set the second square into place, and the sound her breath made grew delicate, and she had to choose between that small sound and the hum, and chose the hum because she understood it offered her more. The other side of the skin had never felt air. It discovered it without surprise. The first part of the thing that met her palm was not bone, not quite, and not flesh either. It was a hard softness, a more patient material. It did not come far. It did not show itself to sight. It rested just under her fingertips, the way a small animal rests at a burrow mouth. For a beat, the apartment held itself like a person choosing a reply. Then the refrigerator's hum altered, a polite adjustment, as if recognizing a new voice. The thin overtone found a richer tone above it. Her teeth ticked once. The radiator exhaled on cue, and the new breath slipped into that exhale as though it had been rehearsed. She felt no stinging. She felt a light pressure and an odd sweetness that did not belong to any taste. A thread of moisture slipped into the cotton square and met the tape and was held. It withdrew, not all the way. The little breach stayed, an agreement. She pressed clean cotton into the place and wrapped her scarf above the towel to hold everything still. The scarf held the warmth in, and the warmth told her that she was not as thin as she had worried. She sat with her back to the refrigerator and felt the hum pass through the wood of the chair and up into her shoulders, and then down again into her chest, and then into the place under her jaw where the new thing had RSVP yes. She slept, a short, narrow sleep that knew the chair's limits. When she woke, the light through the blind had gone from tin to dull nickel. The building's morning sounds feelered out. Someone's shoe on stair metal, a door catching and then letting go, a laugh too loud for this time that did not come again. She unwrapped the scarf and towel and peeled the cotton square away. A small wet mark stared back like a punctuation. The skin had not reddened. The tiny entry was almost an idea more than a place. The inside of her felt quiet in a way that made movement into a choice rather than a reflex. She showered, keeping the water off her throat as well as she could. She dressed in a soft shirt with a collar that sat without telling stories. She made tea and let it sit until it grew cold, because a person does that when their hands have another job. She taped a fresh folded square into position with a neat strip. Her breath did not argue with her while she did it. She walked into the morning without deciding where she was going. The air had learned new tricks since yesterday. It held a faint sweetness at first, like someone had cut open a hose with a knife, and the rubber remembered summer. Then it went flat, with a thin cough of metal. She walked the few blocks to the rail spur because that was where sounds announced themselves without shame. At the chain link, a man in a reflective vest stood with a clipboard that no longer believed in clipboards. He rubbed at his throat in the same square place she did. His eyes moved over her and away with the decency of a person who had decided not to see other people's efforts. "Lines are backed up," he said to the air at large. "Ties got soaked last week with that mess. Gonna be a low day." She nodded. because the way he said it made her think he wanted someone to nod in response. A gull cried from behind the warehouses in a way that sounded like an old tape. The crows watched from the wire like men at a bar on an afternoon that had lost a plan. She passed the clinic on the corner and saw the sign in the door about staffing and interruptions, and a number to call that would not be answered. Someone had added a smaller sign at eye level that said to consult the county website for updates. The tape holding the sign had begun to peel, edges lifting, corners dust-bitten. A man who might have been the guard or might have been a patient stood under the awning and smoked as if performing a necessary part of a rite. "You here for something?" he asked in a voice that felt like tired cloth. "No," she said, "just walking." He nodded like walking was a treatment. She felt the small press inside her, not a full insistence, more like a reminder that it was there, that they were in agreement. She found her note in the hum of a bank of compressors behind the building and carried it home, her feet making the decisions for her. Her throat sat warm and oddly clean against the cotton. By noon, the sky had thinned. Her neighbor knocked once at the door, a cautious tap that asked nothing. Sarah opened, and the woman stood there with a package of crackers and a jar of something red that claimed to be jam. "Grabbed extra," the neighbor said without ceremony. "You all right?" "Getting there," Sarah said, and the words felt true in an unexpected way. The neighbor's eyes dropped to the scarf, and then away. She lifted one hand to her jaw and scratched there without thinking. "You smell that sweetness?" she asked. "Sometimes," Sarah said. "It's like pennies if pennies had a sugar to them," the neighbor offered, and then embarrassed herself by saying the thought out loud, a thing people do when rooms have grown complicated. "Thanks for the food," Sarah said, because this was the correct shape of the exchange. "Call if you need," the neighbor said, and the way she said it made it clear that neither of them had any idea what calling would accomplish. After the door closed, Sarah set the crackers on the counter and shut the jar in a cabinet where sweetness usually went. The refrigerator gave its now familiar answer to her body, and she gave her answer back, a small sound in her chest, more hum than breath. She had not understood until now that two things could hum to each other and not owe a third thing anything. She tried to read a newspaper that had been left in the lobby, but the print swam and the sections clung to each other in the wrong order, and the stories were about roads somewhere else, and budgets, and a forest far from here. She folded the pages and used them to dry the bottoms of the new seltzer cans instead. Ink bled onto the towel in a modest way, polite as a blush. In the late afternoon, she felt the pressure rise again, certain and without menace, an appointment kept. It came slow. It reached the place by her jaw and found what it knew. The skin gave, this time without the show of thinness. The small point met the air without shyness. It did not seek to exit. It touched the world in a delicate contact. For a heartbeat, she imagined that if she spoke just then, the voice would come not only from her mouth, but also from that new door, a chord of notes like two keys in a small organ. She did not speak. She placed clean cotton where it belonged. She hummed the frequency she had learned to find, and the humming and the refrigerator together made a sound like a string held down on a fret and plucked not hard, not soft. The air in the apartment adjusted to this without complaint. The towel warmed. The radiator exhaled. The city continued its narrow errands beyond her thin walls, but that was a story with fewer pages now. As night came up, it brought company. From the hall, a faint chorus of household noises rose, a thinning and thickening of distant television sets, the clack of a spoon against a bowl, the long hush of a shower someone took to unwrap a day. Through these sounds threaded a new pitch, so slight a person might miss it unless they stood very still. It was a fine line of sound, a hair's breadth that seemed to come from more than one place at once. From her own wall, yes, and from the floor under her chair, and from the kitchen where the refrigerator held court, and she felt almost sure from inside her left ear with its learning scrape. Not a whistle, not a whine, a filling. The sound of two edges matched without being asked. She turned out the light and stood by the window and watched the wet light have its way with the alley. The blind leaked a narrow grey. The scratch on the pipe came twice, and then reconsidered. She took away the scarf and the towel and touched the cotton at her throat and felt the small coolness where air reached. It was not a wound, it was a channel. Behind it, the movement did not pace. It held, and in its holding she knew that it had taken the size of this room and the size of her and had found them to be the same measure. She went to the bathroom and looked in the mirror because the face must be met. The oval where skin had thinned was invisible now, the color of ordinary. The cotton covered the place with unremarkable modesty. Her eyes looked like a person, as eyes that had not rested enough but had not given up. She made a face to make the muscles move. The face in the mirror complied and did not look false while doing so. The scarfless neck, pale as always, had a new idea running under it, and that idea was not hinted in the skin. It lived deeper than hinting. On the sink lay a comb and a cheap clip. She picked the clip up and set it down again quietly, because sharp sounds felt like breaking promises. She ran the faucet for a second to rinse a cup. The water gave a brief, sweet smell and then went neutral, and she let it run past her wrists for a second, because the temperature reminded her that some things remained obedient. She turned it off, and the narrow quiet came back in a way that felt earned. She did not sleep much. The apartment had the particular hush of a place that senses that something is happening just beside the ordinary. The hum of the refrigerator, her chest note, the new tone behind her ear, the faint hairline sound in the wall, all took their places on a slow line. She lay and matched herself to them, and the matching was its own relief. When she drifted, it was into a run of images that had more texture than meaning. The woven crosshatch of her dish towel, the fine crack in the plaster by the ceiling, the shine along the inside of the refrigerator door, where a jar had once leaned the cigarette butt flattened by the building door, with its paper fringe gone wet. The next day and the next were like this. She did small tasks with the care of someone building a model. She went to the office when the air felt thin and manageable. The office had new postings about reduced shifts and a suggestion to reschedule non-essential tasks. Forms still slid into places that did not welcome them. The printer still gave pages with half-lives of previous pages tucked like translucent shadows. People wore their masks below their noses and then pushed them up again absent-mindedly. The office manager's eyebrows kept trying. The boy from maintenance came with a small bag of parts and left with a smaller bag of parts. "You doing all right?" he asked one afternoon without looking at her, while he pretended to assess the door closer. "Better," she said, and felt that the word meant a shape and not a value. "Air's got a note in it," he said. "You hear it?" "Sometimes," she said. He nodded and tapped the doorframe with a small screwdriver in a way that might have been testing or might have been nervousness. The tap made a small sound that the thing inside her answered, not aloud, but in the way of a room answering a question with a change in light. She hummed plain and soft, an unclaimed melody, and the boy kept tapping until his shoulders lost a little of their tightness. On the way home, she heard birds making thin statements in a drenched tree. She stood under the eaves of the building long enough to know that she wanted to be upstairs instead, with the refrigerator, and the towel and the cotton and the hum that knew her. She went up and set the key just so on the counter and took off her coat and sat. The pressure rose and kept its appointment, and she kept hers. The small breach welcomed air and then closed itself again under a square. She whispered a word that might have been good and might have been stay and might have been a third thing. The town made the small noises towns make when nothing new can be done that day. Sirens passed at a distance like a folk tale. A train dragged itself through somewhere near, saying the same syllable over and over. a word that meant stop and also meant go. The compressor behind the clinic started up, then stopped, then started again, a rhythm that wore shoes until they learned how the floor felt. The crows, for all she knew, were still doing their math along the rail. The phone on her table, face down, buzzed once with a message from the office saying there would be adjustments again tomorrow and people should check email. She let that vanish into the wood. She looked at the receipts she had stacked and their tidy lies, and then pushed them into an envelope because she had given them enough of her time. The envelope made a small hiss that sounded like a breath through teeth. Toward evening, the fine tone in the apartment expanded slightly, like warm air finding a path it had been measuring. She realized, standing by the window with one hand on the blind cord, that the sound was not only in her apartment now. It came from the hall too, through the thin door. It came from down and from up. It came from the space in the wall that met the pipe. It came from the refrigerator with more conviction. It came from her own throat in that new way, a tone that lived only in the meeting place of air and the small, opened marrow of her. She opened the door and stepped into the hall. It smelled like cold detergent and coffee that had been left on longer than the day asked. The light at the far end had a moth inside its cover that drifted in a slow, doomed circle. The sound, if sound was still the word, inhabited the hall. It was not loud. It had no need of loud. It was a thin occupation. She could feel it in the small bones by her ear. She could feel it in the joint at the base of her skull. She could feel it at the new door along her jaw where the cotton rested like a small flag. Her neighbor opened her door a crack at the same moment, drawn by the same knot noise. The neighbor's eyes met hers and then flicked to the place just below where a person's ear becomes neck. There, under the neat hinge of the neighbor's jaw, Sarah saw the smallest pale spot, a shy moon where the skin had made a plan. No bandage, no tape, just that dimming paleness. "You hear it?" the neighbor asked, whispering though she did not need to. "I do," Sarah said. They stood like that, two women in a hall that held the smell of every day and the thread of something more, and the sound moved through them as if checking its work. Farther down, a door opened and closed, and someone coughed in the small, undramatic way of a person who has noticed a change in their mouth and is trying out what their throat can do. When Sarah went back inside, the refrigerator took up the tone like a hymn sung under the breath. She pressed a towel to her neck and folded a clean square and made the tape ready. She did not think of hospitals. She did not think of machines in rooms where people said that word oxygen and acted major. She thought of the way the mug chip shone like an honest flaw. She thought of the stitch she had cut from the towel. She thought of the old smell of the feed mill on hot mornings, sweet and rancid at once, and how both could live in the same day. She thought of the crows and the wire and the gull that sounded mechanical. She thought of the boy with hair and the screwdriver and the tapping that had matched her breath. She thought of the neighbor's quiet moon. She set the cotton in place and lifted her chin and let the small air pass and the small answer come. In that altered quiet, her body and the refrigerator and the pipe and the radiator and the thin wall and the rooms above and below and beyond found each other. The sound did not swell, it refined, it narrowed and became more exact. It was as if someone, somewhere just out of sight, tuned a long string with a soft hand. A note that was not music, because it did not ask to be cherished, but a note that insisted on being heard. The last light of the day reached along the floor and touched the leg of the table and made it glow for a moment. She closed her eyes, not because she could not bear the sight of ordinary things, but because the sound deserved the courtesy of her whole attention. In that listening, the movement inside her settled in a way it had not before. It did not retreat. It did not push. It began living. Later, when the night thickened and the hum held steady, and even the street forgot itself, she slept. In her sleep, she walked through the rooms of her apartment with the cotton square pressed to her jaw. and every object she passed gave off its small, exact tone. The refrigerator a long branded hum, the radiator a breathy clink, the glass in the window a thin flute note, the towel a muffled warmth, the mug a tiny chipped ping, the paperback on the table a soft page-threaded whisper, the seltzer can a wet sigh at its ring, the roll of tape a sticky purr. She moved her hand along the wall, and the paint told her its age in a faint, dry scuff. She walked into the bathroom, and the mirror did not make any sound she could hear, which felt correct and generous. When she woke, the cotton had a new small mark shaped like a comma, and the skin under it felt young, in a place where young had not been for years. She made tea and drank it with a satisfaction that was not taste. She opened the refrigerator, and the light within did not startle her. She stood there for a small length of time and then closed the door with a care she had not shown appliances before. She turned the dish towel corner up and made the loop lie flat. She wrote the word "hold again" on the square by the stove and underlined it once, just once. The day outside became the kind of day that admits its inadequacy and keeps going. The clinic sign stayed posted. The crows tried a different wire. The feed mill moved its trailers and then moved them again. The office manager sent a message about staggered shifts and looked for a tone that would not scare people. The boy from maintenance found a moth in the fluorescent cover and let it out with a solemnity that did not fit his age. People wore masks and pulled them down to say sentences and pushed them up again when the sentence hurt their throat. Sarah walked to the corner later with a bag of trash that did not weigh much. She set it gently in the bin, because the small office of kindness a person could do for their own refuse seemed suddenly necessary. On the way back, she saw a woman lift a hand to her jaw in the same careful way Sarah had taught herself. The woman's eyes were calm and far off. She stood next to a man older than she was, who held his jaw likewise. They looked almost like people in prayer. Inside her apartment, she opened the window a few inches to air the room without letting the neighborhood in. The air's sweetness had become intermittent, an echo. The thin tone went on. Alongside it, under it, her own hum lived. The thing inside, the not a bone and not bone, the hard soft, the patient, held the place it had taken, and from time to time it reached to meet the air again and then retreated again, a low tide's kiss. The cotton learned the exact size and kept it. Toward evening, when the alley took the pale light the way a plate takes rinse water, there was a knock at the door. It was a gentle, official knock. 3 soft taps that offered her the chance to pretend she had not heard. She opened and found a man in a county windbreaker with clean hair and a clipboard and a small, tired smile that had been practiced. His badge was laminated, and the lamination had trapped one bubble along the side. "Just checking in," he said, quiet, not to disturb anything careful. "We've been making the rounds to see if folks are all right. We've had some complaints about air quality. We're encouraging bottled where possible. Lines flushed today again. There's a notice posted on the board by the mailboxes." She kept one hand low at her throat, a reflex she could not hide and did not try to. The man's eyes did not move there. They stayed on her face in a way that pronounced respect as a form of success. "I'm all right," she said. "Any odd sounds in your place? Appliances misbehaving, alarms?" "No alarms," she said. "Hums sometimes." "Hums," he repeated, writing the word on the form as if it had a box to itself. "If you notice anything worsening, call the number. It'll ring through most likely in the morning. If not, leave a message and someone will listen to it." She nodded. The man's gaze flicked past her shoulder into the apartment in a brief glance that was not intrusive. He listened, she saw, and not only with his badge side. "You take care," he said, and his tired smile did not fail him. He turned and went down the hall, knocking at the neighbor's door with the same respectful knuckles. Sarah watched his shoulders and the way he carried the clipboard, like a small animal that needed coaxing to stay calm. She shut the door. The refrigerator matched her chest. The towel lay ready. The tape waited. The cotton had its corner turned back to show which side was clean. The apartment's thin line sounded, a presence more than a pitch. She leaned her shoulder to the wall and stood there a while, and the paint had a chalk scent like an old classroom. Her throat eased, and the small door opened, and the small air went in and out. Not a gasp, not a bleed, just the smallest exchange. The night that followed had a depth that held things without swallowing them. She dreamed the room again, but this time when she touched the wall, the sound that answered stayed long enough to become knowledge. Not words, not a diagram, a knowing that she and the room were arranged in ways that complemented, that other rooms might be learning this too, that the pipes and the radiators and the refrigerators and the thin spots in skin had found notes in common and meant to see how long they could hold them. In the morning she woke with the taste of clean stone in her mouth and a throat that felt steady. The cotton square had a neat comma, as usual. She made tea and drank it, and it tasted like tea, which surprised her in a way that made her laugh under her breath. She put on her sweater and the scarf and opened the window a little. The day had taken a step toward ordinary. She went to the office and found 3 people and a pair of half-lights. The office manager had given up on a team spin and wore the thin sweater she kept on the back of her chair. The printer sulked. The forms had corrected themselves as if to prove something. There was a note about a rescheduled flush of lines next week, printed in a font that always looked like it apologized. The boy from maintenance stood on a chair and removed another light cover to free another moth, and when he caught it in his cupped hands, he looked for a second at peace, as if the moth's small rippling had tuned his palms. "How you doing?" the office manager asked, not quite as a manager, not quite as a friend. "Settled," Sarah said, and meant it. The day took its shape. Beeps made their small compliments to her ear. The hum did its public work. People spoke less, and if they did speak, they held their fingers a certain way near their necks while they did it. On her lunch break, she went to the washroom and looked in the mirror and pressed the cotton. The surface under it felt not healed, but resolved. She made the humming note under her breath, and the sound made the mirror seem to thicken as if glass bowed to acknowledge. When she left, the woman from shipping came in and stood where Sarah had stood and lifted a hand to touch her own square place, and their eyes met in the mirror, and neither smiled and neither looked away. That evening, standing at the window as the street accepted another stuttering night, Sarah understood that the thing inside her was not a passenger anymore, and not a parasite either. It was a way of belonging. The town had a new club, and none of its members had applied to it. The membership card was a cotton square with a neat comma. The dues were simple attendance. She turned off the light and sat at the table with her hand flat on the wood. The refrigerator hummed, the radiator exhaled, the pipe sighed its thin scratch. Her chest carried her note like it had been born knowing it. The fine line pitched through the apartment, the hall, the building, the block, the spur, probably farther than she could imagine, threading the low things that run a life. The fans, the compressors, the banks of lights with their moths, the clocks with their faces covered, the sink drains, the rolled towels, the mugs with their honest chips. The word for it was not music, and not language, and not weather. It was the sound of the inside of a thing meeting the inside of another without injury, and deciding together to endure. She set a fresh cotton square and a fresh strip of tape by the sink as if they were guests. She folded the towel and placed it close. She untied the scarf and let it sit with its warmth in it. She put the chip of the mug toward the window where the light could find it. The small door at her jaw opened and breathed, then closed. Across the hall, a door opened and breathed, then closed. Downstairs somewhere, a similar small act occurred. She could hear the shape of it now, the way you can hear rain on different roofs and know which is yours. Outside, crows arranged themselves along a wire and took a breath at the same moment without knowing that they had. Sarah lowered her head, the way a person does in a church when they are not sure about prayer but respect the idea of posture. Her breath and the room's breath met, and somewhere in the walls, just past where a person would reach with a reasonable hand, a tiny, hard, soft point tapped, and then rested a node in a pattern that promised nothing except that it knew its own tone. The pressure inside her and the room outside her reached a balance that did not ask for her permission anymore and did not require her refusal. She stayed like that until the hum became a place, and the place held. She thought of the word hold, underlined once, on the paper by the stove. She thought of what it means to hold and to be held, and how the difference between those two acts is sometimes smaller than a breath moving through a new-made door in a human throat. Then she stopped thinking, and the sound in the room and the sound in her and the sounds in the rooms around her did not stop, and the night went on, thin and exact and enduring. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing for more content. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Feel free to leave a comment below with your thoughts or questions. I love hearing from you. Until next time, take care and stay awesome.